Hello and welcome to Eras and Icons. My name is Clarissa Schuler and I'm joined today by Dr. Michael Coulter. Thank you for joining us.
Clarissa, it's great to be here today.
Before we jump into our topic for today, which will be St. Thomas Aquinas, we're really excited to talk about him. I want to introduce Dr. Coulter. He's a political science professor here at Grove City College. He specializes in political philosophy and also local governments and state government. So we're really excited to have him joining us today to talk about a really prominent philosopher in both a religious aspect and a political aspect. So thank you for joining us.
It's great to be here, and it's always great to have an opportunity to talk about Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah, so before we continue on talking about some of facts about Aquinas' life, what led you to studying political philosophy and gaining an interest in a figure like Aquinas?
Wow. Okay. So as someone about your age, I remember, in fact, my junior year, so a little bit younger than you, there was a professor who taught a course here where we read Plato's Republic, Locke's Second Treatise, some writings from Hegel. And it was that course that sort of connected my interest in politics with my interest in philosophy. At the time, I was a double major in political science and philosophy, but there weren't many political philosophy courses here at Grove City. It was just sort of there's philosophy over here and political science, and that course helped connect those interests for me.
Who was the professor of that
The
course?
professor he was then provost. His name was Jerry Comby. He'd only been at Grove City for 2 years, and then he taught that course. He was actually a student of Alan Bloom, the important translator of Plato and political theorist. But when Bloom was at Cornell, and so Comby, as a provost, only taught 2 courses, I think, in a couple of years. He was mostly doing his administrative work. He actually became president of Grove City College in 91. So he was president of Grove City. I graduated in spring of 91, and he became president in fall of 91. But it was Jerry Comby, who was trained as a political philosopher, who introduced me to political philosophy. And I'm very grateful for him doing that. And he passed away about 2 years ago. But I look back fondly on. I remember that course very well.
Does he know that you chose to pursue that area of study? From him?
Yeah, very much. In fact, he's ultimately the reason why I ended up at Grove City College.
Wow, that's awesome.
But then there's a second question of how did I go from just being interested in political philosophy to Thomas Aquinas? And I didn't read Thomas Aquinas until I was in graduate school. And at first, it was a little strange. It's not the way we write today. Some of his writings have this question and answer format, and it took a little while to get used to. I would joke that sometimes reading Aquinas is like an acquired taste, but once you acquire that taste, it's great. He is very, very wise. He is remarkable in the sense in which Aquinas draws on philosophy and theology, and he wrote, really literally thousands of pages, and did this in the 13th century when there was no computers to assist. He truly was a remarkable intellect.
Yeah. So for our listeners who aren't as familiar with Thomas Aquinas, besides maybe having some name association, could you give us an introduction to who he was and why we talk about him?
Sure. So in some ways, there's some very interesting parts about his life. In the 13th century, he lives in the 1200s. And we think he was born in 1225. He might have been a year or two before that. And he dies in 1274. We have a pretty clear date of death for Thomas Aquinas. But and he was born into a moderately well-to-do family in sort of south central Italy. His name literally is Thomas of Aquino. It's the name of a little town. You could go to where that town is today, and literally just means like a water spring. Think of our word, aqua. But into a family that was like a regional noble in what was then a kingdom that governed the area in Italy south of the Papal States. So he's in his family. We're Christians, as you would expect nearly everybody in Italy in the 13th century. And there's some evidence that his family wanted him to become a Benedictine. This is the Order of Saint Benedict, which was a prominent religious order. in Europe at the time. And he was the youngest in a large family, and it was not unusual for youngest male children and families to go join a monastery.
Hmm.
Now, so he had been educated, it appears, this is what the evidence points to, you might say like equivalent of like junior high and high school by Benedictines. There was a very prominent monastery that some our listeners might have heard of called Monte Cassino that still exists today. It's a very important monastery. But anyway, the short of it is that he was drawn not to become a Benedictine, but to join this relatively new religious order. So religious orders are like an organization
Hmm.
sort of approved by the church, the Catholic Church, who they can carry out special missions or functions. And the Dominicans is the popular name of an order founded by a French figure named, we refer to as Saint Dominic. And this was a religious order, only got established mostly came together in the late 1100s. And it was a group whose function was to teach and preach.
Hmm.
And the Dominicans were known as the Order of Preachers. So a Dominican order exists today. And religious orders are known by like the initials that follow their name. So it's O period, P period. In Latin, it's like the Order of Preachers.
Okay.
And so it was like the intellectual order. And the other thing that's very important here is that the Dominican order, and there were a couple of orders doing this, is they weren't located limited to a single location. So for the first several hundred years in which there are monasteries, you go to that monastery and you stay at that location for the rest of your life, as long as you're a member of that religious order.
Yeah.
What had emerged are some religious orders where they almost had like campuses, places you would go to. And why this is important for Thomas Aquinas is that it allowed him to study with some very important figures of the 1200s. It allowed him to be at important centers of learning and discussion like the University of Paris.
Hmm.
And he studied with also this important thinker named Albert the Great, who was in what is today Cologne, Germany. And he also at times was in Bologna, so where there's a very important university there. So by being a part of the Dominican order, he was able to sort of focus on the intellectual life,
Okay.
and he could kind of move around and be connected with the most important intellectual debates of the 13th century.
Yeah, so thinking about the 13th century, what are some identifiers for how we think about that time period? Because was this the rise of scholasticism?
Exactly.
Okay, so that's where we see
Right.
Aquinas and the ability for him to be able to learn so much too.
Sure. That's really important that you brought that
Okay.
up, is that so what we refer to as scholasticism is the rise of the schools.
Okay.
That's where this comes from. And in a couple of places in Europe, you had the establishment of universities.
Hmm.
They had their origins in, like, you might say, educational institutions associated with churches or cathedrals, sometimes called cathedral schools. But out of some of these schools in places like Paris and a few other places in Cologne, they formed a university. So we have the University of Paris, and we also have things like the University of Oxford is established. So there is enough interest in the intellectual life to direct some resources to found a university. Now, these universities were very different than what we might think of today. There's no dorms or football teams.
Hmm.
They really were places where people came to study. They were beginning to have things like degrees, but they mostly studied philosophy and theology. Sometimes they would have a faculty of law, sometimes even like a faculty of science, but they were not. There was no business, administration or engineering being studied at these locations. These were places for theoretical study, we might say.
Okay, that's interesting.
So that's one part of it. The other is the establishment of universities.
Mhm.
But another very important thing that happens in this time period is the reintroduction of the texts of Aristotle. So what happened? So Aristotle lives in the 300s BC.
Mhm.
So more than, roughly 1500 years before this. And his texts were in Greek. And what had happened is that as there were fewer and fewer people in what we think of as Western Europe who could read Greek, and the texts were actually mostly in some libraries in what was then areas controlled by Islamic groups. But some of those texts of Aristotle in the late 1100s, early 1200s became translated into Latin with some very reliable translations, it's thought. And so Aristotle became like, became hot again. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it became like the thing that everybody's reading and talking about and trying to think about ways in which Aristotle, could either help us think about things or understand them, or in ways in which Aristotle might be wrong.
Hmm.
So Thomas Aquinas is deeply appreciative of Aristotle. He calls him the philosopher, right? So another place, the master of those who know. But he's also very clear and very willing to criticize Aquinas. Pardon me, he's very willing to criticize Aristotle
Mm-hmm.
when Aristotle gets something wrong, like Aristotle doesn't really have a doctrine of creation.
Mm-hmm.
But for Christianity, that there's a point when God creates all things is very important. And that is something where Aquinas criticizes Aristotle for not having. And that obviously he's very, Aquinas is quite clear that Aristotle doesn't have divine revelation, so he's
Yeah.
not engaged with that. But Aquinas is very much interested in the insights that Aristotle has about all kinds of things,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's logic or morality or politics, or how we think about philosophy. So Aristotle is a tremendous influence on Thomas Aquinas.
That's awesome. Those two A names do get a little confusing, that's for sure.
True.
So,
I will do my best.
yeah,
Yeah.
same with them, Augustine, like it
Yeah.
really just adds up. So looking back at Aquinas, when he becomes a Dominican, well, he joins the order of the
Right.
Dominicans. Correct me if I'm wrong, but in some of my research, I was seeing his family was supposedly sort of wealthy, and the Benedictine order was a bit more wealthy, where the Dominicans prioritize like a life of poverty.
Sure.
Did that come into play at
Yeah,
all?
there's this story that comes, and it's
Okay.
probably true, but it's that his family wanted him to be a part of the Benedictine order, like being the abbot at Monte Cassino,
Mhm.
the chief religious figure at this abbey not far from where he lived, was a very socially prominent position.
Yeah.
And to go and join some upstart, new religious order who didn't have, amazing facilities like the abbey at Monte
Mhm.
Cassino, that was that did not enhance the family's reputation, immediately.
Mhm.
And there was this story that he was sort of locked in his room and not allowed to go study with the Dominicans, and his family tried to tempt him. Those stories may have emerged much later, but it presents Aquinas as like serious about intellectual study and like very devout Christian.
Yeah, so thinking more about his Christianity, it seems like he was raised in the faith and then joins the Dominican order. And we know now that Aquinas is a very important figure in Catholic teaching, but
Sure.
also in Christian teaching as a whole.
Sure.
Very important. So, where does that grow through his writings or through his legacy as left throughout
Yeah.
history?
So I think that's a great point you mentioned. I just want to this follow up on that first. Is Aquinas is obviously deeply appreciated in the Catholic intellectual tradition,
Mhm.
both in theology and philosophy. There's actually a number of Protestants who find Aquinas to be quite insightful about important questions of theology
Mhm.
and philosophy. There's a famous Protestant theologian named Norman Geisler who wrote a whole book about sort of why Protestants should care about Aquinas. And there's a Reformed theologian named R.C. Sproul who wrote a short article, but it got circulated a lot, of "Should Old Aquinas Be Forgot?" And arguing that no, that even people in the Reformed tradition could learn from Thomas Aquinas. So first, he is appreciated by
Yeah.
both Protestants and Catholics. He does hold a kind of a special place for Catholics in the Catholic intellectual tradition. Now, how did he gain this renown? During his life, his intellectual abilities were recognized, and he went from being a student at the University of Paris to being a professor there. And that was an important center of theological debate.
Mhm.
But he was also kind of connected to other institutions. It wasn't like you were a professor at one place for your whole life in the 1200s. So during his own life, he was connected to some important intellectual debates about how you understand truth.
Okay.
And he was also sought out as a theological advisor to both bishops and other theologians, but even political figures sought the advice of Thomas Aquinas. He was never a political ruler, but there's one text that survived to us. It's called On Kingship, that it appears that he wrote for like the king of Cyprus at his request. So during his life, his renown was recognized, and in the period not long after his life, his writings were circulated, and he was seen as this very important figure, and he sort of proclaimed a saint and a teacher in the church. It's a phrase called a doctor of the church. This means like a teacher, in the 1300s. So it's pretty quick, the period from the time of he lives and dies to not long after his life, his reputation spreads. Now, what helps that reputation spread is a couple of works that he writes. The most famous work he writes is probably the Summa Theologiae or Theologica. It's referred to. That's the same work. And there's another work called the Summa Contra Gentiles. Those are probably the two most famous works. And I'll just mention just briefly about the Summa Contra Gentiles, then focus on the Summa Theologica. The Summa Contra Gentiles was like a summary of theology, a summation, pulling it together. It's generally thought that it was written almost like a guide to when you're communicating with non-Christians. All kinds of questions about how do we know God exists and other ways to defend the faith. That work is important, but I think the work that really gets a lot of attention is the work I refer to as the Summa Theologica or Summa Theologiae. And this work is unbelievably large. I've never read all roughly 2,000 pages in English. I've read large chunks of it, large portions of it, and I teach it.
Doesn't it come in volumes?
That's
too?
right. It's made up of 3 volumes, and it's written towards the end of his life. And the 3rd volume is never finished. And there is this story that Aquinas has this sort of like spiritual vision where he says, count all my works as straw to be burned up. And that we're not certain that actually happened, but something happened at the end of his life where he didn't finish it, right? But again, the size of this text is amazing. When he only lives roughly 50 years, when he depends upon writing things by hand, and there are stories which seem to be true of like fellow members of the religious order helping to write down and make copies of this text. But the text does a couple of very important things, and I think we can just mention like part 1 is about the creation and fall of human beings, and so that's a very important theme. And then part 2 is the way in which God brings us back to him. So things like law and grace, and there's all those long sections on how we understand what it means to be human. And then part 3 is the part it's really about the church and the sacraments. So it's part 3 that's probably the least read portion of it today. And the parts that are read are the beginning of part 1, which has a discussion about what is theology and what is philosophy and how do they relate. It's a long discussion on God's nature, and it engages with arguments or discusses arguments for the existence of God. So though like that part is given a lot of attention by scholars and students today. And then in part 2, where it's writing about what it means to be human, there's a great discussion of what are the virtues, both the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, and the cardinal virtues like justice and temperance and courage and fortitude, right? So, but they have these, you have these virtues that he talks about, but also in part 2, what is in part 2, there's a discussion of law, a set of questions known as the Treatise on Law, and that's the portion that I really love teaching. I probably teach more of those passages than any other in Thomas Aquinas.
Those are definitely the ones I'm more familiar with too from your classes and other Grove City classes. We read Aquinas a lot, but that's actually the perfect segue because I would love to talk about section 2 in the Treatise on Law, specifically because Aquinas is usually, we kind of assume that he's responsible for our idea of natural law. I hope that I'm getting this right. Yeah. Well, not getting graded, but
you still get a good grade here today. But
thank you.
Well, I think he is important for giving us more insight
Mm-hmm.
into natural law. You could certainly make the argument that other writers before him, at least a couple, make
Imply it.
references to something like natural
Yeah.
law. There's a something like that referred to in Augustine,
Mm-hmm.
so a Christian figure, but it's not really well developed. Cicero, the Roman writer, makes some kind of reference to natural law,
Mm-hmm.
but it's in the context of that section known as the Treatise on Law that Aquinas gives us more. Although I always say when discussing this passage that like I wish Aquinas had spent a little more time. In fact, in
Mm-hmm.
that Treatise on Law, which what is a series of like topics about law. In fact, the topic that gets treated longer than even natural law is the law as found in the Old and New Testaments. So there's a lot of discussion in there. Most people don't read those passages. Most teachers don't assign them. But in this treatise on law, he begins with talking about the types of law. And he says there's divine law, which is really
Mm-hmm.
like God's ordering of all things. And then there is, but then he says, is there a natural law in us? And so natural law here is not something separate from divine law. It is that part of divine law that is sort of built into our nature.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, a natural law it gets a little, I think, difficult because we're used to law as a thing written down that has very clear commands. Do this, don't do that, right? But natural law, as Aquinas presents it, is really like a set of inclinations and design that we
Yeah.
have as human beings, right? And so, like we as human beings, the first thing that we do because of the way that God made us to seek the good, right? So, but our sinful nature also works against that, right? So we seek the good, we should, or are designed, made by God to seek the good, and seek the good, and we should shun evil, right? But sin disrupts that in us. But so that is a sort of that's how he begins to talk about these inclinations we have. But God made us with not only the capacity or the inclination to seek the good, but to live in community with other human beings. That's part of our inclination. So as a natural law inclination, we seek to live with others, right?
Mm-hmm.
As in human community, we're not, highly, isolated organisms like some animals might be. And we're also made, we have certain natures that we're made. We have certain sexual nature, right, that is designed to sort of operate in a certain way, right? So that, there is, that with those natures that we have, like, you know, lead to childbirth, right? Or lead
Yeah,
to
it's like
childbearing.
designed to have more
Yeah,
community.
yeah.
Yeah.
And we also have inclinations, not just for the opposite sex, but we also have an inclination to care for our young, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there's various inclinations we have as human beings, and that those the way we are, right, help us know what we ought to do. So for Aquinas, there is some connection between, again, what we are as a human being and what we ought to do as a human being. And by the way, another inclination we have is to seek to know God,
Mm-hmm.
right? We seek to know things, including divine things. So that's what I think he means by like a set of inclinations. And in fact, when he speaks of it in the Treatise on Law, it's a natural law in us,
Mm-hmm.
right? And these inclinations might help us understand moral precepts, moral ideas.
So building off of that, because of these natural inclinations that every human has in their heart, like divinely inspired, the natural law.
Sure. Then,
Because of that, when we're forming laws to govern society, does Aquinas believe that they always come back to those intrinsic set of ideals?
sure. And so the next type of law that
Mm-hmm.
he discusses is human law.
Yeah.
And that human law should be based upon moral precepts. And we find those moral precepts. One way human beings can find those apart from divine revelation,
Mm-hmm.
just sort of reasoning about the world, is that moral precepts are discoverable or knowable. And so like a law that would um, protect a person from theft or harm would be something that we could reason to as part of our like we have a natural inclination, natural law inclination to preserve ourselves.
Yeah.
And so society would make laws to enable people to preserve themselves. That would be like punishing murder or theft. And because you need laws against those things to preserve human beings. And you would have laws that protect and preserve families because that's the way human beings are transmitted right over time. And so there are, we can know certain moral precepts about what's good for human beings. And then we should, often or usually we can make laws or should make laws with those moral precepts in mind. Now, it's not that everything that the natural law would teach us would be necessarily turned into a human law. Aquinas is in some ways a kind of realist about human beings. Is that some human communities might be it might be possible for them to have very strictly moral laws, but there might be some political communities where certain kinds of moral laws might not be possible. Think of it like some human communities might be able to have a strict law limiting activity on a Sunday, but other cultures might not. Right? They're because of the nature of the culture in that area, and so Aquinas doesn't think that every natural law precept is turned into a law, but every law should be able to be tied to a natural law precept.
So I know in certain classes that we've had together that you teach, usually when discussing natural law, we'll start somewhere with Aquinas, and then it normally builds onto whoever took his ideas and continued to run with them.
Sure.
So thinking about those people and how Aquinas's ideas have developed through the 13th century all the way up to laws that we see today being drawn back to an internal morality. Who were some of those thinkers that helped move along that process? And do you think we could tie that to like the American founding too, or any of those other
there's a lot of
ideas of common law?
there, but let's talk. Let's try.
Sorry, it was a loaded question.
It's all right, not loaded. It's all good. Lots of parts to it. So first, what happened to this tradition of natural law? I think it was fairly prominent until the Enlightenment, so 1400s, and certainly Catholic thinkers sort of developed notions related to this. There were some early writers in the early 1500s, a little later, who use it to think about the development of international law. So norms that help govern how we interact with people from other places. So there's some famous writings in that period. Hugo Grotius would be is considered a founder of international law.
You can't forget that name.
I know, it's a funny name, the Dutch thinker, but who very clearly is indebted to Aquinas. And there were some other writers during this period as well in the 1500s, 1600s. But we move up to the 20th century. In fact, we'll just pick two more recent ones. There is a Princeton professor named Robert George. Robert George might be familiar to someone listening to this, but Robert George is a professor of jurisprudence at Princeton, but someone for whom Aquinas is very important. And he's in many ways sought to kind of translate the ideas of Aquinas into you might say the concerns of the 20th and 21st century. So, for example, one of George's books from the 90s is called Making Men Moral, and where it's how do we, law is not just something that minimizes conflict between human beings, but law has a kind of teaching capacity. It helps people, direct people towards the good. And that's a very Thomistic idea, which is really the formal way we refer to ideas of Aquinas. But he gets to be referred to by his first name. But and so Robert George has, you might say, is deeply informed by that. And so you think about the purposes of law. That law is not something just a neutral instrument for preventing conflict or enabling human cooperation, but law should direct us towards the good. Right? And George goes on to make an argument. He writes a work in defense of same-sex marriage. He writes a work opposed to same-sex
Against,
marriage.
yeah.
Sorry, wow, that's a bad error on my part. Where it's like he's trying to defend laws that restrict marriage to male and female, and it's the argument that he's trying to make a natural law argument
Mhm.
for that, right? And it is so it's not like just citing scriptural passages, but citing laws that or citing ideas about the importance of the nuclear family and
Yeah.
children being raised in that context and laws that protect the more traditional family. So Robert George is one who's influenced by that. Another person who takes some of the same kind of ideas that law should be informed by morality is someone he's born and raised in Australia, and he spends a lot of time at Oxford, a political philosopher named John Finnis. And Finnis is associated with a position known as the new natural law.
Hmm.
And what he does is the argument was certainly compatible with Aquinas, and he clearly owes some intellectual debt to Aquinas, but he really is taking it in a kind of new way, this natural law. And what he argues is there are certain goods that we need as human beings for us to flourish,
Mhm.
right? That and some things that we can obtain in this world are better than others. It's not that you know um, every activity is equal. And so for Finnis wants to argue that there is a set of these goods that would enable a flourishing life, and that political order needs to seek to protect those goods, which would include things like marriage and family and order and some degree of liberty
Mhm.
and access to religion and access even to things like recreation and play. And in some ways these might seem obvious, but if it's the idea that like political life is not just neutral about what is the good, but there are very clearly known goods for human beings, and that law can help to support the acquisition of those goods.
Mhm.
So Finnis is referred to as a new natural law theorist. He had a student when he was at Oxford, when he was teaching at Oxford, in Neil Gorsuch, who's now on the Supreme Court, and Associate Justice Gorsuch. You can see in some of his opinions where he is informed by the thought of John Finnis.
Awesome. So thinking more about the idea of the American founding, because I know I just
Okay.
kind of threw that out there and
Okay.
then got distracted with the 7 other questions that I asked you at the same time. But thinking about Aquinas's idea of natural law, and obviously there's other people who have built off of him, but thinking about the words like man endowed with inalienable rights,
Yeah.
rights and sort of a natural guiding law,
Yeah.
sort of like
Yeah.
principle that runs through the American founding.
Nature and nature's God, the
Yes.
language from the Declaration. So this is a bit more complicated
Mhm.
in the sense is that we have very little evidence that people of the American founding era are reading Aquinas.
Mhm.
Right? Very few Catholic thinkers here. But there is, for example, an English writer named Richard Hooker, who is writing in the late 1500s, who is deeply influenced by Aquinas. It's like a Episcopalian version of Thomas Aquinas, and that some people in the founding era are reading Hooker. John Locke cites Hooker in the second treatise. So, like some of the ideas about an ordered universe of a connection between law and morality are present at the founding. Now, Jefferson's idea of like endowed by with certain inalienable rights that Aquinas didn't use that language
Mhm.
of rights, but Robert George tries to kind of connect the two. For example, when he says that like you can use the language of rights as a way of getting at certain goods that we want for people, like the ability to worship and to have free speech, and which is part of like learning and knowing.
Mhm.
And like the language of rights that's more common in the late 1600s and 1700s captures this idea of like certain goods that are needed or due for human beings. And so we use a different kind of way to describe it, but some of what Aquinas might be describing and some of what the American founders may be describing, would overlap. The American
Mhm.
founders would seem much more individualistic
Yeah.
than Thomas Aquinas. There's a clear sense for Aquinas that we are embedded within particular human communities.
Mhm.
There's a much greater importance on like tradition and passing on knowledge for Thomas Aquinas than in the American founding. There is a much stronger, you might say, current of individualism,
Yeah.
but certainly on the sense in which, I mean, there's certainly a sense in which law helps to bring about goods for human beings,
Mhm.
and that law has a kind of moral component to it. And certainly at the founding, even though they wanted freedom of religion very clearly, um, there was a sense in which the law helped direct people towards their good. It was very hard to get a divorce in
Mhm.
1700s or 1800s in the United States. There were and even though there was not you know requirements of people to go to church, some states actually had requirements to be at least someone to believe in God, to hold public office.
Mm.
Right, the federal government did not have a religious test, but certainly some states did, and there's a very clear sense in which being having a strong religious identity was certainly important in the founding era, and some state colonies then states had like established churches.
Mhm.
So um, there's a clear sense, I think you could say, that political life was to help direct you towards the good, to acquire goods for human beings. That there was ultimately a moral basis for much of what is in the law.
Mhm.
It's only much later in the 19th century where law is seen as sort of either just pure power or just purely neutral with respect to the good. That law was one of was one of a couple of things that could direct you towards the good.
Yeah. Well, sorry for asking that question out of nowhere because we do somewhat prepare for the questions I'll ask, and I did not prepare that one. I just kind
Yeah.
of thought of it. But thinking about Aquinas and political life, a sort of fun question that I had wanted to ask you
Okay.
is if Aquinas was around today, what political ideologies or ideas do you think would primarily concern him?
Wow. Well, I mean, there is always a little bit of a tendency to want to make some figure from the past,
Mm-hmm.
you know, support your views or something like that. I mean, Aquinas is very much interested in protecting and preserving political community. That's a very important thing. He's wants to protect individuals and help individuals achieve goods, but he's also not like a radical individualist.
Mm-hmm.
That's, I think, pretty clearly the case. There was a set of political parties in Europe particularly beginning in the late 19th and early 20th century, known as Christian democracy parties.
Hmm.
So Italy had an important party of Christian democracy from the late 40s until the early 90s. In fact, one of the most important parties in Germany is the Christian Democratic Union, and these parties, these Christian democracy parties, and they existed in a few other continental European countries. They were, they wanted to have a political order that encouraged, moral and religious life. They did give privilege to the religious institutions very clearly, like the church played an important role in post World War II Italy in education, and the church was given an important role in charity and so forth, and directing charitable organizations. But they also wanted to do things like make it hard to work on Sundays, and there were laws that made divorce quite difficult, for
Mm-hmm.
example. And I think you could make an argument that you could show some linkages between ideas of Thomas Aquinas and Christian democratic movements in the late 19th and early 20th century. In fact, many of those movements get their start from Catholic bishops, and there's a document from Pope Leo XIII in 1891 that's sometimes seen as a kind of important founding document in Christian democracy.
Hmm.
So it's it's an interest on it's concerned about morality. It's about having a political order that is not, it doesn't try to take over the role of the church, but tries to support the church.
Yeah.
And I think that could work in the European context where, in many of the European countries where there's essentially one church,
Hmm.
it would be harder to imagine how that would fit into our U.S. context,
Yeah.
where we have these competing religious groups. I mean, Thomas Aquinas, for all the things that are very interesting and thoughtful, he was not a defender of religious freedom. He does some points where you should tolerate non-Christian religions. He does make an argument for tolerating Jews, uh, but for groups that he would consider heretical, that is, rejecting what he thought was the true teaching of Christianity, he didn't think those should be tolerated. So it'd be a little harder to figure out, like, how does Aquinas handle a world in which there is multiple expressions of Christianity?
Yeah.
But I do think he would want us to think of, like, the important that we want to have laws that encourage community. We have laws that protect human beings. Um, that privilege, that give a special privilege and importance to family life. I mean, this may seem, a little bit too much to make this connection, but in American law, we now have these child tax credits
Hmm.
because they're to make it easier for people who have families. I could see Thomas Aquinas saying, "Yeah, that policy gives a kind of special status or importance to families,
Yeah.
and it helps them. And family life is a kind of central component of political life." I could see him, certainly supporting laws that protect freedom of conscience, that enable workers to be free from work on days of obligation,
Hmm.
Sundays or other religious holidays. That you would want a culture that encourages a religious life.
Yeah, that's awesome. I was very curious to see what the answer would be to that question because I know it's like it's hard to place historical figures
Yeah,
and be like, well, what would they
yeah,
think about this? Like, there's
yeah.
actually no way to answer that question. But
Right.
thank you so much for the insight that you gave.
Sure. There is a challenge in this,
Yeah.
but I do think there are some broad ideas
Yeah.
that still remain applicable. Certainly about that law. Um, Law doesn't represent all of morality, the Aquinas position, but it certainly should be connected to morality.
Hmm. So, one last question before we call it a day and you head back up to your office, I'm sure, and I go to class. Um, I was wondering, we ended our last podcast like this as well. If you have any reading recommendations on Thomas Aquinas
Oh.
or things that he's written that people should read or books about him, just for our listeners if they want to learn a little bit more.
Wow. So I didn't. I should be better prepared on this one. There is a nice biography of Aquinas by G.K. Chesterton called "The Dumb Ox." That gives you a little insight to his ideas and life. And I mean, some scholars have some criticisms of it, but I think it's a way of introduction.
Hmm.
Um, some people may have heard of. He was a philosopher at Boston College for a long time, Peter Kraft. Peter Kraft wrote a short little book called "A Summa of the Summa," which is it's a way of just sort of picking out particular passages. It's maybe 200 pages long or 175 or something, and it's like highlights of it. I think anyone who would try to read the entire Summa Theologica, it's big, it's bulky, it'd be intimidating, but a short little volume that picks some pieces, that pieces out for you. Yeah, and I think I would just encourage people to, even go to like a website. There's a website called newadvent.org that has the entire Summa on it for free, and pick some of those early passages at the beginning of part one. There's ones about does God exist, and he engages with arguments that Aristotle and others used about the existence of God, um, or to think about the existence of God, and you can easily find to get to the treatise on law. But really, you could kind of just pick some passages. So one would be a kind of complete original source. One that Summa of the Summa is a sort of short highlights, and maybe G.K. Chesterton's work as a kind of short biographical introduction to his life and ideas.
Well, thank you so much for those recommendations. I hope that you guys all wrote those down. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, great, and have a great remainder of your senior year, and we will miss having you at Grove City College.
I'll miss it too. Well, thank you again, and thank you for joining us on Eras and Icons today.